The conference, or this session, sorry, not the whole conference, Delivering Defence, a new strategy for the British defence industrial system. Should, of course, read the UK industrial system, not least because of the huge amount of good stuff that gets done in Northern Ireland at the moment. On a serious note, and obviously it's a serious panel, but we can't help but be influenced by events over the weekend. And my intro had previously talked about Ukraine and the lessons of Ukraine and what that means. And then, of course, we've seen the tragic events in Israel over the weekend, which Keir Starmer has utterly condemned, using the phrase, an appalling act of terrorism. And good to see in a display of political national unity that the Prime Minister has made similar unequivocal condemnatory comments. And it's interesting that Keir Starmer then spoke about absolutely recognising Israel's right to defend itself. And I think that's what we're here to talk about this afternoon, just to unpack that phrase, defend itself. Because as we look at this multipolar world now, I think we're starting to see all sorts of pressures across the globe. As I said, I was going to start off thinking about Ukraine, but we see pressures coming out of Africa. Look what's happening there with Russia and the Wagner Group. We see similar fomentation of unrest around the Balkans and around the Caucasus, indeed. And so there are pressures everywhere. So what does defending yourself mean? And I'd argue that we have made, collectively, UK government across many political stripes, of the last two serious administrations, all sorts of policy decisions, but also some minor, almost unnoticed policy decisions that come out of structures and incentives. And it's probably this political party that did the last thorough and comprehensive review across the board with the SDR in 97, 98. But then, of course, we made some serious modifications in the UK come 2010. And I would argue that the interplay of those has left us in a certain position. As you look across UK defence, you can certainly point to some extremely good equipment, what some people might refer to as shiny toys or exquisite kit. And there are still some absolutely superb people and committed people that work across the depth of UK defence. But that word depth, I think, is what we'll probably come back to. And I just throw one stat at you. The Ukrainians, going back to where I said I'd start, the Ukrainians at the moment are burning through something like 10,000 drones a month. Here in the UK, going back literally decades, our two major drone programmes will between them now be spending £3 billion and will procure somewhere between 50 and 70, depending on how you count them. Nor are they particularly survivable. So in a war like Ukraine, you'd be lucky if those lasted into the second day. And so I think that poses some very serious questions, given that backdrop as to where I started, as to what the depth is behind that front line with the great people and some exquisite equipment, because actually it's your defence industrial strategy that provides the national arsenal that allows you to defeat the threats. And this is not a warmonger's point, but if our adversaries look at us and work out our arsenal can't actually support us in a conflict, then it doesn't matter how shiny your front line is, because there will be net assessing your capacity to actually defeat them, and that is what underpins your deterrence. Now, I'm not going to say any more. That's my introduction, because I'm sure the panellists will have much better things to say about those points and many others as we go through the panel today. My plan is, so I don't interrupt the flow of the conversation anymore, is just to briefly introduce all three panellists. I'm sure many are very well known to you. And then I will invite them all to say a few words. So the order in which they're going to speak, we have Luke Pollard, MP for Plymouth and Devonport, and I think the first locally born Labour MP since Michael Foot.
That's right.
In the immediate post-war period. Shadow Minister for the Armed Forces, but has taken a great interest to look at his parliamentary history and all sorts of defence matters. Not surprising, given your constituency, but also that your father was a Navy submariner. And therefore, to an extent, you have been born into it. And if you go and look at his academic career, an extremely good degree with research into the politics of the EU and to international terrorism, which also goes back to our introduction. The second speaker though I said hello Baroness earlier on, Baroness Anderson of Stoke-on-Trent, she said please Ruth Smith, which is probably how she's said.
Still Anderson, with Dumping Smith.
Ruth Dumping Smith. I say better known to you in the past as Ruth Smith, Ruth Anderson. Currently, the shadow Defence Minister in the House of Lords, but also Chief Executive of the Index on Censorship, originally set up actually to provide a platform in support of Soviet dissidents in 1971. So there was a real commitment there to freedom of expression. In her parliamentary career as MP for Stoke-on-Trent, she was both Vice Chair of the Parliamentary Party and a member of the Defence Committee for some while. So once again, a great interest in defence. And referring back to the introduction, has been a long-standing member of the Labour Friends of Israel. And the final speaker this morning will be Steve Turner, the Assistant General Secretary of Unite, Britain's largest trade union, and with a particular interest in the manufacturing sector and therefore defence. Of course, we think about aerospace and shipping when we think about those things, but also, Steve, I'm sure you will take a massive interest in things such as secondary interests, such as the national supply chain that supports all of that, and then behind that, those tertiary things without which you wouldn't have a supply chain, such as skills, apprenticeships, etc., and the whole workforce that underpins that national arsenal. So I'm going to finish those introductions there with that idea. We're here to talk not just about the shiny stuff at the tip of the spear of defence, but everything that allows a nation to credibly defend itself when war comes. Because as we look around the world, war has come to a lot of people recently, a very serious subject. So if I may turn first of all to Luke, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming along to this discussion. I'm very proud to be a Janner, someone from Plymouth, who represents a military constituency. It matters because keeping us safe isn't just an abstract concept about national security, it's about jobs and skills, and in the constituency I represent, it employs an enormous number of people, both in uniform and civilians supporting those in uniform. And as a party, it is good to be able to be on a platform and say very clearly that Labour backs our armed forces, we back our membership of NATO, and we back our nuclear deterrent. And those things make a difference. They make a difference looking in the faces in the audience because you know the importance of national security, you know that we're living in more uncertain times at the moment, and you know that the commitments that we make as a nation not only relate directly to our safety and security, but importantly relate to those allies that are in even more unstable parts of the world. And we only need to look at our friends in the Baltic to see the threat that is taking place there with an enhanced forward presence from the British Army, the Baltic air policing operations, the work that our armed forces are doing supporting our friends in Ukraine, as well as an enormous amount of operations around the world, reassuring our allies. That's a really important global role that Britain has, but over the past 13 years, our armed forces have been hollowed out and underfunded. That's not my quote, that's Ben Wallace. He said it in the House of Commons. And the last Labour government, as you might have heard from John Healey if you listened to his speech this morning, left the Conservatives with defence spending at 2.5% of GDP. That has never been reached before. Since then, the Conservatives have not only cut the size of our armed forces, they've left potentially us with capability gaps at a time when we need our military to be fully operational and deployable at short notice, potentially for some very dangerous situations. Now, that is quite an inheritance that the next Labour government could inherit, because a stray missile could change things enormously for our country. We are living in uncertain times, and we're living in dangerous times. And so what Labour's defence policy is seeking to do is not only to rearm and rebuild our national capabilities, but also to make sure that we offer strong deterrence, not just a credible, continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent, which means we need to refit the Vanguard submarines on time in Devonport and we need to build them on time in Barrow, making sure the design works from Abbey Wood and the reactors come from Derby on time. But we need to make sure that we have a credible conventional deterrence as well. And if you're looking at capability gaps, especially in the army at the moment, there are real challenges to offer that credible deterrence. But that credible deterrence also needs to sit, as Edward described it, in the softer side. We have huge skills gaps across our sector. But this is an enormous opportunity for Britain. I was in Barrow a week before last, seeing the amazing submarines that are being built by a skilled, talented, well-paid and unionised workforce. Exactly the type of workplace we should be encouraging right across our country. But to build the Dreadnought submarines and the AUKUS submarines that we need to have as a nation, Barrow needs to be nearly twice as big as it is now. And that means not only investment in the yard, that means investment in housing, in skills, in transport, in culture, in the high street, to make that work. Now, that's not something that sits either in the portfolio that I have or Ruth has, but if we don't have that, we don't have a viable defence industry. So we've got to start joining these bits up, and that's one of the things that John has been speaking about. And if you take the submarine enterprise just alone, it's a high-end piece of tech that is being built in Barrow. It's high-end supply chain going into those submarines. But it's not yet the national endeavour that it really needs to be. And if it is to be a national endeavour, to maintain our deterrence, to have world-class and battle-winning hunter-killer submarines, it needs to be something that joins up not only the different bits of the Ministry of Defence, but the different bits of government. And that is our real challenge, because we've seen in Ukraine new emerging ways of using technology, some high-end stuff. The power of a Storm Shadow missile has been demonstrated quite spectacularly in the attack on the Baltic in the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. But also, as Edward mentioned about drones. Now, we can get Gucci high-end drones, but we'll also need to make sure that we've got disposable drones in the event of stuff. We need to make sure we've got enough 155 ammunition, which we don't have, enough shells for the artillery. We need to make sure that in renewing our small arms capabilities right across the NATO alliance, we're not repeating mistakes from the past and having different ammunition types all over the alliance. There's enormous challenges here, but what I want to focus on is also the opportunities at home. The opportunities of getting this right are more jobs. And I speak as a Devonport MP in Plymouth, and I would love there to be more investment in Plymouth, but do you know what invests in Plymouth year in, year out? Defence. And in constituencies and communities like mine, right around the country, it's not the most affluent communities that always have defence manufacturing in, but it's communities that have good, skilled jobs that, if we get this right, will provide generations' worth of employment of good, well-paid, unionised jobs. And that is the opportunity for us to get here. Because if we don't get this right, there's a real risk to our national security. And last week I was in Warsaw at the Warsaw Security Forum. Now, being a Labour politician in European events for the past few years hasn't always been an enjoyable experience, with colleagues looking at us, asking some questions about what we were doing, a confusion about our strategy, and a concern about our absence. That was not what I felt in Warsaw. What I saw in Warsaw is our allies saying to us, we need and we want Britain back. At the table, on the international scene, leading the way, making sure that as part of the E3 with France and Germany, we are leading the way, in not only international diplomacy, in deterrence, in military operations. Now, that is a huge opportunity, and it's one that John Healey has already set out with our ambition to create a new security agreement with the European Union and new defence agreements with Germany, and renew the one that we already have with France. These are opportunities to strengthen our position, because at any single moment, more than any Labour government has had in decades, potentially, we could be calling on our military to fight not wars of choice, but wars of necessity, coming to the aid of our allies facing, as we have seen in Ukraine, horrendous slaughter of civilian populations, targeting people, using sexual violence as weapons of war, and devastation on a scale that we have not seen on our continent for a very long time. We have to get this right, and to get this right, we need to have a new approach. And I'm very happy talking in elements and questions about what that could be around specific technologies and where we go. But let me reassure you that Labour is back on defence. We have a clear plan about what we want to do. And I think when you compare the records of Labour in government to Conservatives in government, we've always seen that Labour governments spend more on defence and offer a better national security than the Conservatives. Our challenge is how we tell that story, make that clear, especially in those marginal seats, and often defence communities that need to hear it. That's a good start of a 10. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So defence as an investment, the opportunity, the whole point about deterrence is something that we'll have to consider across the depth. The dual use of high technology and the spillover, mentioning Derby and the vital importance of partnership and allies. Could I come to you then, please?
I feel it's really unfair when you've just had one shadow minister from the same team and now I've got to follow. I'm going to start actually where Edward started. The world moves so incredibly quickly, and 2 weeks ago I led the debate I closed the debate in the House of Lords on events in Ukraine. I did not expect to wake up on Saturday morning to see the events in Israel. We knew that British citizens were going to be caught up in Ukraine, as it proved to be, and that the impact on our community, we've just had confirmed that there are 10 British citizens who are missing or dead in Israel. We live in a global world and our citizens are everywhere. So when it comes to your question of how do we defend, who are we defending and how are we defending, there's never been a more serious time to be considering it. And I say it with people, as someone who has many members of my family are in Israel. So let's start with what that really could look like and how it should look like, and what we need to start doing that is beyond the politics of defence, because if there is one area where there should be absolutely no politics, it is our national security. Our national security is too important to each and every one of us. There should be no political point scoring. And I'm going to do that horrible political thing and say all the reasons why the Conservative Party are wrong. But actually, we need to look at the underlying foundations of our national security infrastructure. What is there that we need? What do we need to replace? And how can we ensure that when we inevitably have to pivot from one part of the globe to another, it doesn't require us to do another SDSR, to do another defence white paper and to start all over again, which we are seeing every time something new happens. So one of my concerns right now, I think AUKUS will be the anchor for our defence infrastructure moving forward, but that requires us to have an ongoing commitment to Indo-Pacific for the next 50 years as a minimum. And that requires us to consider and to be much more imaginative about what Pillar 1 is, which is relatively straightforward for everybody in this room, but Pillar 2 could be anything. Pillar 2 requires imagination. Pillar 2 requires us to think strategically about not just today, but actually where we're going to be in 20 or 30 years. It requires us to consider who our real strategic allies are, who else we want to bring in, and why we want to do it. And then how much money we're going to commit to it. So I start from a perspective of national security is everything. But actually, it's the defence family that has to be part of this wider conversation. And what I loved about Luke's comments is none of this is done without the people that make the platforms we talk about, because they are providing the platforms for their sons and daughters to use when they're deployed. So we need to step back a little and think about this as a defence family and about defence industry. And for me, with AUKUS at the centre of it. One of the other things that I think is that we've already touched on, but we're going to have to be much more imaginative about our use of platforms and what that looks like going forward. I am an honorary captain in the Royal Navy. I can't tell you how much I love our aircraft carriers. They are amazing platforms. They have let me, because these are crazy people, they have let me play with the simulator and land an F-35 on the aircraft carrier. They've let me sit in an F-35. I can't tell you, I am sold on the platforms. But do we need to spend £1 billion on a Type 45? Or could we have spent £800 million and had 90% of the capability? Could we consider different types of platforms, and should we actually be starting from a point of what are we trying to achieve rather than what do we want to buy? And if we start at that point, in a world where it is harder to recruit for people to serve in the armed forces, when war is changing in front of us, when AI and tech are going to have an impact, I think we need to consider the mix of platforms that we use, the skill set we're trying to recruit, and then how we're going to solve those problems. So defence will look differently when we're talking about platforms, and defence should look differently when we're talking about how we build them and where we build them, as long as they're built in the UK.
Oh, pushed so many of my buttons there. Speed of events, if I could link when you talked earlier about flexibility or adaptability, but of course, and then what you said at the back end, the imagination, and especially to think around what I would paraphrase as the economics of lethality, when few platforms that cost us billions of pounds vice the 10,000 swarming drones perhaps that Ukraine's getting through a month. And then that final point, which I've written down here, will use myself. Do we think through what we want to achieve rather than what do we want to buy, which is a question I do hope we come back to in Q&A, because I think that underpins a lot. Thank you very much. Could our final panelist, could I come to you, Steve?
Great. Thanks very much for that. And it's very easy to go last, of course, because you can paraphrase what other people have said. I'm going to try and avoid that and not repeat what other people have said, other than to pick up on Rachel's last point, I suppose, which was
Ruth.
Make sure that...
Rachel did an amazing speech earlier on.
Ruth. So Ruth's final point, which was to make sure that it's built here in Britain. And as a trade unionist representing tens of thousands of workers in our defence industries, that would be my number one priority, to ensure that we have a stable, secure, well-skilled, highly professional workforce in design, in engineering and manufacturing across all of our defence capabilities, actually, here in the UK. And what a great debate it was earlier this morning in the hall. And you opened up by saying it's a dangerous world, and it is a dangerous world. There are many conflicts around the world, and we have to find peaceful solutions to those, not necessarily military ones. But the reality is, whilst there are conflicts and whilst we have to put in place measures to ensure that we can defend our own national security, we have to do that in a way in which we maintain and protect our national capabilities to defend ourselves by manufacturing here in the UK. And for too long now, we've seen billions of pounds of taxpayers' money simply spent overseas, buying products off the shelf rather than developing the skills and capabilities that we require and hold, actually, here in the UK. And that's about freedom of action. It's about our national security commitments to the UK, but also our allies, of course. And it's about making sure that, you know, when we need new product to support our armed services, the first point of call is to come to those primary manufacturers here in the UK in a discussion to see just how it is that we can build that product here. We've lost the ability to build many of the in-service vehicles that we require. So if you look at land defence, for instance, the FAST that is out there with Ajax at the moment is in part because we lost our capability 10 years ago to manufacture land equipment here in the UK. And we handed that over to overseas suppliers, and now it's become a farce, in effect. And we've got to ensure that that doesn't happen again. And if we're going to do that, there are two primary pieces of equipment that we need to make sure we've got long-term investment in now. One's already been mentioned, of course, which is AUKUS and the programme there on submarine defence, the alliance that we've got with the United States and Australia, of course. Colleagues from Barrow will be building that product. The engines will be coming from Rolls-Royce in Derby as a nuclear propeller. And it's not a nuclear sub, and we have a lot of debates even inside my union about this being an attack on the non-proliferation treaty. And of course it's not. This is not a nuclear-bearing, weapon-bearing submarine. This is a nuclear-powered submarine, and the source of that power comes from Rolls-Royce in Derby. And that very same source is going to transition into a civil capability, of course, with small modular reactors, which equally will help us to get to a net zero position and generate the energy that we need here in the UK by purchasing SMRs from Rolls-Royce here in the UK and not again off the shelf from somewhere else. And of course, the second piece that I wanted to touch on is where we are with Typhoon. The replacement of Typhoon, which is Tempest, of course, and long-term demands on investment from central government as a pump primer in all of this to give confidence and credibility to the programme with the partners that are on board with Tempest. We've got the Japanese and the Italians on board with us there. Japanese need a replacement combat aircraft by 2035. If they see chinks in the armour of Labour's policy through another defence review, for instance, and that undermines confidence with our partners, then I'm very much afraid that we could see our competitors, the French with Raphael and others, come into play in that argument. So long-term investments in good jobs, unionised jobs, as has already been said. We've got tens of thousands of well-paid, skilled union members procuring product and producing product here in the UK to support our armed services, and we need to make sure that that is the case for many, many years to come. And we support the communities as well that have supported these companies over generations now as we move forward from Barrow to Derby to Devonport. You know, we built the Type 26 on the Clyde, we're building the 45, we've got the 31 being built, but of course the reality is the steel from that is coming from Sweden. So we've got a steel crisis. We've discussed it in the hall this morning as part of a non-existent Tory industrial strategy, of course, but what Labour are going to do to defend our steel heartlands. And part of that is making sure that we manufacture the product that we require here in the UK, and we source and procure that product from the UK. So the knock-on impact on jobs across communities, across all of our nations actually, is huge. If we look at the requirement for Typhoon, I mean, Typhoon's coming to the end of its normal life, but it's stretched to its limits right now with our NATO requirements, with the conflict in Ukraine, defending our northern borders, of course, from stray aircraft coming in from Russia and everywhere else. We have to launch our aircraft. And the reality is we now need to place new orders for Typhoon. And we've got deals with the Saudis, of course, with Poland, with Turkey, with various nation states that are looking to replace their aircraft as well. But the reality is if we can't deliver that within a time frame with the finance and the skilled labour force that we need to do that, then they will also start to look elsewhere at our competitors. And if we lose our national capability to defend, we use our freedom to operate as well. And that's incredibly important for us. For every £1 that we spend on defence, the multiplier effect will see pounds coming back to the Treasury. And we forget that sometimes. You know, billions of pounds are spent overseas and we see no, other than an end product, we see no economic and social value added to that. And when we talk about the F-35, which we bought off the shelf in the United States, it lands on our aircraft carriers that Ruth spoke about earlier. We're meant to have 15% work content on that. And the reality is we'll be lucky to have more than 10% work content on that. And yet it was our UK intellectual property that helped to build that. It was our vertical takeoff and landing technologies. It was our stealth technologies that allowed the US to build the F-35 in the first place. And now we're not even getting a work share equivalent to that was actually agreed in the first instance, protected UK jobs here. And we see that time and time and time again. So my plea to all of us actually, but particularly to an incoming Labour government, of course, is we understand there's going to be a defence review. But there are long-term spending commitments that we need to accept and buy into and not create uncertainty around, because that then draws our partners into long-term relationships with us that puts us at the forefront of developing the next generation of technological armoury that's going to defend our nation and others, dependent on the politics of the day. But most importantly, from my point of view, protects hundreds of thousands of good, well-paid, skilled, unionised jobs. There are over 3,000 suppliers into the Typhoon programme alone, UK suppliers into the Typhoon programme. So this is thousands of communities that are impacted by what we do in relation to defence spend. Thanks, Ed.
Steve, thank you very much. I mean, you spoke there about the security that comes from a well-skilled workforce, which I think links, Ruth, to the points you made about imagination. If you haven't got a well-skilled workforce, where does the imagination come from? You talked about buying national to maintain that, and I'm sure in questions we'll come back to the implications of scale in that. And one answer you already talked about was AUKUS, and I'm sure we'll come back to what the UK position is. And very interesting, you talked about really national security across the board, i.e. that small modular reactors is essentially a technology and a skill set and a workforce that comes out of the nuclear propulsion of our submarine business, and therefore that helps us address arguably the biggest national security challenge we face in climate change. And then the final bit, I'm sure we'll come back to that as well. You talked about protecting IP and whether across government we actually fight enough for the IP that we put in. Have we let a few other countries maybe be a little rapacious with what we've provided? So some fantastic points from all our panellists there. Now, I've learnt my lesson here before and gone to questions from the audience too late. So I just want to, before I start the panel discussion, can I have an idea of those who've already got questions that they want to ask? Okay, so we're not going to be led by me because there are folk who have got a lot that they want to say. But one of the things I did want to come back to is this idea of partnerships. And if I could just address that question, which I think always crops up, which is, if you do want to buy British, and as we've said, a lot of the stuff we make here is of excellent quality, how do you manage to create such a demand that you can keep the production lines going, etc., etc.? Maybe we might think about some of the partnerships which you all reference. So if you could ask all three of you to expand on that idea. I don't know who wants to go
Shall I
first.
kick off?
Yeah.
So our policy is to buy, make and sell more in Britain. That's especially true in defence. But that is not about creating a big fence around Britain saying everything needs to be built here. What that does say is that we should also collaborate and cooperate with our allies on global programmes, and Tempest being a good one. The AUKUS Pillar 2 in particular that Ruth mentioned, another one, but there's many more besides. If you look at the Gripen fighter, for instance, from Sweden, well, a Gripen fighter could well be a British fighter, 30+% of it comes from the UK supply chain. What we need to do is collaborate with our international friends. Now that does mean a fair work share and a fair IP retention. But it also means the realities are that our military cannot in itself sustain enough orders for most of the Gucci platforms that we need to just deliver them alone. So we need to have export-ready variants. And that's to the point that Ruth was making. If we specify equipment to the nth degree to make it so perfect for the UK military's operational requirements there and then on the day the contract is signed, we frequently lock it out of export markets. So how can we make it 95% what we need and open up opportunities elsewhere? How do we make sure that we are building out obsolescence? Because far too much of the equipment we are buying has elements of obsolescence when it comes online. There's a real challenge here about that partnership and working. And as a party, what we have said is that we want to work with our nearest allies and our global allies. So that is our NATO allies, our Five Eyes partners, and those additional powers, especially in the Indo-Pacific, where we can start building the similar category platform needs and worker platforms that work across all of that. Now that does mean work share. That does mean building to our strengths. That does mean an understanding that the main components for nearly everything we buy may not be built in a British factory, but we will gain more jobs in the supply chain, in the design, and in the operation of those than if we just held it to ourselves and have a feast and famine, which has been the destruction of far too much of our defence industries in the past. And that is something that we cannot repeat. So work share, smoothing, proper planning, drum beats, all these things that might not get the headlines, but actually could be transformational in terms of how an effective industry and a labour defence industrial strategy will work.
It's interesting, isn't it? A country of 8 million people, Swedes, with a very good high-tech defence industry, can produce something as capable as the Gripen, and 30% from really British aerospace and other countries. So a very interesting idea. Ruth?
I think that one of the things we've seen a huge amount of over the last 10 years is the government talk about soft power and the prosperity agenda. And yet what we've seen is, in terms of our procurement policy, our own procurement policy, it not applying. So it's all we have wonderful engagement with militaries around the world. We work with our allies day in, day out. We have the Royal College of Defence Studies where we literally train every senior officer in every military around the world who we are allied with. And then we try and sell them kit that is made in the UK. And they go, well, does the RAF use it? No, they buy American. Does the Royal Navy use it? Not all of it. No, we don't. We've decided not to buy it, that platform. Actually, if we're going to engage in the prosperity agenda, if we're going to make this work, then we have these incredible advocates. We need to make sure that they're using the kit that we've decided, and that we've collectively decided with industry to build in the UK, because then we've said it's the best in the world. And we have to do that in a way that we know that interoperability will work with our allies, that this is not at the cost of how we will work together with all of our alliances. This is to supplement it. And as tech changes, that's going to be even more important than it was before. I just also want to touch on, because I know that Steve will also want to do this, but I'm very proud of Tempest. I think it is an extraordinary thing. But I'm also personally proud because I led the campaign in Parliament and had the first debate on getting us Tempest, and got a Conservative Defence Secretary to commit £1 billion to Tempest. That's why this has to be cross-party, because what none of us can afford is, in, please God, a matter of months, but I hope weeks, no, but a matter of months, when there is a new government, I pray, that everything changes and we have to do a new SDSR and it takes another 4 years and we have to do another review before we can do anything, and then everything is put on hold. Procurement becomes challenging. Our relationships in terms of our partnerships, well, can you just wait till we finish this defence review? We can't afford any of that. So we're going to have to make sure that we can build on what's already there to get on with the work, because we need to get on with it.
Thank you very much. I should have worn my RCDS tie now.
Oh,
Give me a good visual aid.
I'm doing RCDS this year.
Excellent. Well, I used to work at a fine institution.
Fine institution.
And very interesting you introduced Tempest, because as I look at the Tempest programme, the underlying technologies, it seems very similar to me to AUKUS Pillar 2. And when we sort of talked at the start about the democracies coming under pressure everywhere, one wonders whether one couldn't rationalise a little bit and find further efficiencies, but maybe we'll come back to that in the Q&A. Steve?
Yeah, look, all of our capabilities have been the subject of alliance building. I mean, exports of Typhoon, Typhoon is a European programme itself, and exports of Typhoon from the UK have been incredibly profitable, actually, to the UK economy overall. But of course, going back to the jobs argument, have supported tens of thousands of jobs, skilled jobs here in the UK, which are coming under threat now, of course, because of the skills crisis that Luke touched on earlier. We're trying to find skilled labour. We've got 1,000 apprentices at BAE, but 1,000 apprentices is not enough when you're losing 1,000 people at the top end every year. So the reality is we've got to train tens of thousands, tens and tens of thousands of young people and adult apprentices as well. We've got to, transition the current workforce to be able to deliver on the skills that we need in the future, as well as to train young people to have those skills to give us the capabilities that we need. But procurement is broken, and that's not me saying that. The Defence Select Committee was very clear that the procurement strategy of the UK government is absolutely broken, and you can see that with the FSS contract, Fleet Solid Support Ships. You've got 3 ships there, equivalent in size to the aircraft carriers, of course, and the programme went out to international tender, and a Spanish consortium have picked that up. Now, we've got promises of work share. Now, I wait with bated breath to see exactly what that work share will translate into for ports and yards around the UK. I have my doubts as to exactly what will come back to the UK as a consequence of that. But procuring from UK yards, and the Tempest programme is a great example of that, with the engine being designed in Bristol, again at Rolls-Royce, but of course in Salisbury and in Walton up in the northwest here, they'll be manufacturing that. But that again will be an alliance, that will be a partnership. And as I said in my opening remarks, in a moment that's with Japan, it's with Italy, there may very well be other alliance partners that come on board with that. And there will be some sharing of technologies, some sharing of capabilities, some sharing of build, no doubt, on all of that. But if we lose our capability, our sovereign capability here in the UK to defend ourselves via the manufacture of UK products, then we leave ourselves in a very, very dangerous place. We lose our freedom to act. Very often we're using technologies that are bought in from overseas, and overseas partners have the last say on whether or not we can use those technologies or in what capacity we can use those technologies. We have to retain our national capabilities and our sovereign requirements to defend ourselves in our own interests. And you can only do that by skilling up the workforce here and manufacturing what you need to manufacture here. And I understand that's not everything. Of course, that's not everything. But there are strategic things that we need to make sure that we retain here in the UK.
Thank you very much. And I would just point out, because the one thing that hasn't surfaced is the Joint Expeditionary Force, where we're the framework nation for 10 pretty much like-minded North European democracies. Maybe one could standardise across those 10, even within NATO, and there would be a market there. Before I come to the audience, so I just ask briefly if I could just come back and link a few thoughts. You talked about working out what we want to achieve rather than what we want to buy. Has the Labour Party given any thought to the incentives I mentioned earlier within the Ministry of Defence, where after the Levine reforms in 2013, we talk about an integrated force of 5 domains, but we still allow a lot of freedom to 3 services to go and buy what they want. And that's not necessarily what the UK wishes to achieve. And if I just ask some brief thoughts on that, and then I'm going to come to the floor.
Well, I think to a certain extent the Levine reforms have already been rewound in part by the government looking at elements of this. I think that there is, without going into the internal plumbing of the MOD procurement system and the budgeting system, there is certainly, I think, more scope for joint procurement across the different services, for a better way of doing it. I am personally quite attracted to joint as a way of working, partly because our services now are individually quite small relative to where they previously were set up. And the element that we don't talk about very frequently is all the capabilities that sit under strategic command. The military folks in the room will be nodding at this. The folks that might not be following it will be questioning what is strategic command. And it is basically this the joint delivery of UK capabilities that sit across our services. Now, I think there's more scope to do that, and if we can demonstrate a much more integrated way of working, we've got a better option. And Edward, you spoke about those different domains. Multi-domain integration, I'm quite a fan of. I'm a bit of a nerd of it. I think MDI is a terrible name for it. I prefer all-domain warfare. But effectively, what it seeks to do is say that every single domain, the ones we're used to, air, land and sea, but also with cyber and space, electronic warfare across the spectrum, all of those need to be brought together. And at the moment, our technologies for our forces don't allow that interoperability within UK forces to the extent that I think we would like, let alone the interoperability across those domains, across an alliance operating model. Now, we need to be more joined up, more joint in our approach as how the UK fights, but the UK does not fight alone. And it is really important we understand this. Our operations, in the event of a combat, are always alongside our allies. Always. So we need to make sure that our forces, our combat approach, our strategies, our procurement, and all the bits that sit behind that, so beyond the front line, making sure everything that sits behind the supply chains are interoperable and joined up with our own forces and elsewhere. So there's a really big challenge in how we do that, but I think there's, again, great opportunities around efficiency and around joint working, so we're not having a hierarchy of badge caps or uniforms, we are having a focus on effect. And if we have the focus on the effect and the outcome we're looking at, I think we will find more efficient ways of procuring, more efficient ways of operating, and that will be good for the taxpayer, and most importantly, it will be good for winning battles and deterring our adversaries.
Oh, yes, gets my vote. Thank you very much. Ruth, I'll briefly come to you, and then Steve, and then I'm going to open the floor.
I start from the place of what are we actually trying to achieve, and there is a balance here between soft, sharp power as well as deterrence. So we've got to ensure that we have such range and scope of potential capability that we have every option available to us that we have collectively decided that we want. And we do that without thinking about the really shiny thing over here. And my concern is when I sat on HCDC, when I sat on the Defence Select Committee, I had one of the senior, had a member of senior brass in, and they said, and we will surprise nobody in this room, that I wanted to buy British on pretty much everything. And they were pushing back and said they wanted to buy American. And so we said, do you just want to buy what the Pentagon tells you to? And he said, yes. Now, that is not where I would like to start this. I'd like to start it the other way round. I would always like to start it with a buy British, but much more importantly than what anyone else tells us to buy, what are we actually trying to achieve with it? And so it's the wrong question. I fear that we always start procurement with, there's a really shiny thing, it's really pretty, it can do really exciting things, which, by the way, Ajax was meant to be able to do and can't. And there are so many defence procurements that we have gone along with that we haven't been able to deliver, because we've gone to see that really shiny thing as opposed to, can we talk about how we could upgrade Challenger? So there are other conversations that we need to have, and we need to take it back to basics, actually, rather than do shiny. Sorry.
No, I think so. The lesson of Ukraine, I think, is equipment that's good enough, operated collectively and well with imagination, beats few shiny things operated without. And I think there's one of the big lessons that comes out already. Steve?
I'll defer to the politicians and I'll leave it to questions from the floor. I agree, actually, with what's been said.
Hands going up already. So Tim at the back there, and then I'm going to come down here. You've had your hand up there, sir, and then I shall come to you. Over in the back there in the check shirt. First to get his hand up. Could you say who you are, please?
Good afternoon. Tim Brickley, I'm a
question.
journalist, editor for Defence Eye News Service. Question for Luke and Ruth about driving behaviours in the Ministry of Defence. I know Ed for a long time, and some of his colleagues in the Admiral, Air Marshals and Generals Trade Union behave very badly. And is it not time to end the revolving door, particularly to ban senior officers from working for American companies? If they lose their chance of getting a job on the board of an American company, they're less likely to buy
Tim,
it.
I'm going to cut you off there because that's a great question already, and we're going to come to others. So, revolving door. Gentleman here in the shirt.
Are we taking some together? Or
Ruth, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I think there is sometimes a place for a revolving door, by the way, and some of the place for the revolving door is how we ensure that women and other people can come in and out of the military. But I think we need to look at coming in and out of the military so that people can leave and come back and we don't lose expertise. My biggest issue with how we have historically procured and how it relates to decision making is that people's tenure is 3 years over programs that are going to last for, well, AUKUS is a case in point, we're talking 50 years, but actually, decisions that are being made now, when we realise something has gone wrong with a decision, those people are either well promoted or well retired by the time we get there, and no one has responsibility for final decision making. We need to be much more driven. We need to use commercial expertise, and we need to ensure that the civil service as well as brass are involved and there is clear accountability so we can make sure that these things are delivered. It won't surprise you, I'm a former trade union officer. In fact, I'm a former trade union officer for Steve's union. Yeah. So I'm not going to ban people's employment rights going forward for where they might want to work. But having clear processes that I would have to have if I left ministerial office, please God I ever get ministerial office, that would restrict my future employment. It should be exactly the same. And for senior brass it is, but it's making sure that works effectively and that it is still within our national security interest.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is we've seen under Boris Johnson's government that the public trust in appointments for ex-ministers fell to a new low. And as a party, we've committed to reform the ACOBA system, so the appointment system for those outside of senior ranks within government. And that is because the public doesn't have confidence in it anymore. And I think one of the things that I certainly aspire to is I look to how can we restore confidence and trust in the work of government, in the pursuit of public service that have been so damaged by 13 years of government, but in particular damaged by the last 4 years of government. And one of those is how we look at that across the board. So it's not just looking at MPs or peers when they leave ministerial office, it's looking at senior ranks, but we shouldn't neglect and throw away the experience. But we should just make sure it's done fairly and transparently. Now there's a happy medium there. It's not a balanced equation currently, but I think there is a way of balancing it better than we have currently.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Ian Waddle, I'm the General Secretary of the Confederation of Shipbuilding and Engineering Unions. This is turning into a bit of a union meeting, isn't it, rather than a fringe. Anyway, obviously I represent people who work in shipbuilding, engineering, aerospace, all the industries that Steve covers. And I just wanted to say to Ruth, in terms of a defence industrial strategy, my view is that starts with what is the UK's place in the world, what are the threats that we face, what technologies do we need to counter those threats. And the platforms actually come quite a long way down in that. And I think the industry would absolutely welcome that strategy, the sense that there is a long-term plan that is based on our place in the world and the threats that we would face. That makes absolute sense. I think everybody in the industry has been crying out for it for years. What I wanted to pick up was what then happens with the procurement process. It links into the question that was asked about the MOD, actually. A few weeks ago, had a meeting with a senior civil servant.
I'm going to do what I did to him. Can we cut?
I'm coming to the question. The
Please.
senior civil servant in the MOD who procures ships, who said, I am bound by the rules to put everything out to competition because of the WTO rules. I want to apply social measures, but I'm told I can't by the Treasury and the Attorney General's office. And my question is, there are simple levers that I think could be used, which is to say, number one, competition isn't the default, but where it does happen, we need to take into account social factors in measuring it. And I'm absolutely struck by what you said, Luke, about making these things national endeavours. Can we make shipbuilding a national endeavour? Can we make the building of aircraft a national endeavour? The building of helicopters a national endeavour, as well as submarines? I think that would make a fundamental difference.
Right, good. A national endeavour. So, political question, and I'll come to you, Steve.
I don't buy the argument that we couldn't have kept the Fleet Solid Support Ship contract in the UK. Just as Ruth was making the same debates about combat air, I was having and leading similar debates on shipbuilding. In my mind, the Fleet Solid Support Ship was a complex warship. The law already allows us to restrict that contract to UK bidders only.
Yeah.
Right? We chose, or we didn't, the government chose not to do so. So I think there are powers that the government already has that they're not choosing to use. And as we saw from John's announcement on the floor of the conference floor today, when announcements are made, we need to make sure they're actually delivered upon. So the £2 billion for ammunition that was announced in March, not a penny spent, not a contract signed. Labour would do things differently, and that already exists. It's already an option using urgent operational requirement procedures that you could have put that order in to be generating the jobs, but most importantly, generating the effects that we're looking for to do it differently. And the government is choosing not to use those powers. We don't need to legislate necessarily to change those. We just need to have a government that would make the choices that look at social value, look at the long-term investment in skills, and is true to that drumbeat. Shipbuilding strategy only works if there is a drumbeat of ships that maintains the skills and the facilities, because building a new dock is really expensive. It's as expensive as building a new workforce, right? So a drumbeat needs to work, and when you start taking projects out of it and giving it to our competitors abroad, they get the docks, they get the skills, we lose out in that space. So I think the next Labour government would do things differently, and I think that would be better.
Thank you very much. Right, next question, gentleman with glasses.
Thanks. Will Gray from Luther Pendragon. Luke, I know you said you didn't want to get dragged down a rabbit hole into intricacies about the procurement process, but what are Labour's plans for DE&S's role in it all? Obviously, you can set the policy from above, but in terms of the on-the-ground management of...
Could you just hold the microphone a little bit closer?
The on-the-ground management of those procurements, what do you see their role being, and whether and if it's changing at all under a Labour government? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a fair question. So in this debate, we often talk about reforming MOD procurement policies. And what that translates to is, what does main building do when you look at the plumbing? And main building has a very clear role, but actually what DE&S and on defence housing, what DIO and what facilities the other bits of defence land operate is just as important. I think DE&S are being held back by a broken procurement system that they themselves sometimes control, sometimes operate in, and responsibility for that broken procurement system sits with main building, but also sits with DE&S. And so if we are to try and get a reformed procurement system, which we need because we are burning through taxpayers' cash and wasting it at the moment, as Labour has set out with our waste dossier, we're going to need to have a different approach. That does mean a different approach and calculations on risk, calculations on drumbeat, calculations on skills and upfront capital costs, 1 year budgeting, which seems like a bonkers way of doing things. You must spend all your money in each 1 year because we can't trust you to do it over a number of years, is a hideously inefficient way of spending. There are ways over time that these systems can be reformed, but we're starting out with that high ambition that our system is broken, This is not an opinion. This is an evidence-based approach that multiple sources have come out with. The industry know it's broken as well. There is a real determination and opportunity, which only really happens once every 15 years at a change of government, be that red to blue or blue to red. And we need to not waste that initial window to make sure that we've got changes as we need it. And some of those relate to easy, quick wins. If you're on a project, you're on a project for longer, so your career promotion is linked to the success of that project and your work, not just a matter of how many days have you been on that project, through to bigger procurement exercises around the legal risk and around spending profiles. So there's big and small changes we want to make, but we've got a window where we need to make it, and I think a real determination to do so.
Thank you very much. The lady here, then I come down to the gentleman at the front, and Nigel, if there's time, we'll get to you.
Hello, Georgie from Talis. Hello. It was a question about joint working and Stratcom, really. Are there any kind of cultural things you feel need to change, having gone around and met people from different services, to enable that joint working a little bit better? Because I think we still find there's a bit of a dark blue, light blue, green rivalry. And further to that joint point, obviously Stratcom deals with a lot of areas like cyber and space that are quite cross-departmental. Do you envisage any kind of change about how that might work structurally under a Labour government?
Could I come to you first, Ruth? You've observed the culture over many a year.
I have observed the culture, and mostly it's friendly rivalry, as long as the budgets are agreed, in my experience. I think we need to get to a point where we're actually reassuring each service that we've got their back, because fundamentally that's what politicians are there to do, to help work with them and to facilitate change. I also need to correct something I said earlier. Obviously, I was loose in my language, which I must not to do, but we're working with everybody to make sure that we've reviewed every contract every position that we'll do in our first year, and it will have to be some form of defence review in our first 12 months. And that will be our mechanism for ensuring that all services are brought in. But actually, more fundamental to your question is the new areas that we're going to have to move into. And cyber, we don't know what that really looks like yet. We don't know what space really looks like yet. We're currently writing the law on what space is going to be from a military perspective, because it doesn't exist. So when you're starting from that point, actually, this is a really exciting time, and that is a way to bring in the traditional services into how we can develop with them what answers could be. Because fundamentally, as Luke touched on, would we create the military as it's currently created if we were starting from scratch? Probably not. I don't want to scare anyone in uniform by saying we're about to scrap the forces, because of course we're not. I'm very proud of the senior service. I wear blue. But looking at about new threats, new challenges and new spaces gives us an opportunity to change culture within main building.
Luke, do you want to...
I think joint working is the way forwards, and how you do that increasingly, I don't think you necessarily need to change culture. You need to make sure that everyone that joins the forces has an opportunity to be joint right from the get-go. And do you know what? Quite a lot of them do, actually. And so we need to make sure that's there. I'm a big fan of space and cyber, actually. How we deliver cyber is predominantly via a lot of our private sector partners. So it's a completely different delivery model than how you deliver land combat, for instance. I think space is an opportunity area for enormous growth for the UK. We are by far one of the best small satellite builders in the world. It is bizarre to me that the government now wants us to build big satellites and to move into an area where we will be crushed by our opposition, and negating the fact that we are world leaders at small satellites. So let's build to our strengths. The space strategy, as a good example, that is a cross-departmental strategy. It's good that we've got one, because we didn't have one for a long time. We now need to develop that further, and the bit that is missing, in my mind, in quite a lot of these big strategic pseudo-defence strategies is the bit that will, I'm sure, for your comments earlier, skills, right? Because the skills bit is absent from our space strategy, it's absent from our cyber strategy, it's absent from much of our defence strategies, and the government's approach that says, right, Primes, you build a skills centre next to your main production site, it may cover most of the skills you need, maybe not. We'll resource some of it, but probably not all of it. But don't worry about your supply chain. They're on their own is a skills strategy that is doomed to fail. And that's one of the reasons why Bridget Phillipson has been setting out reforms to the FE sector, reforms to the apprenticeship levy to make sure it works. But for defence to work, we can't just have primes hoovering up all the skills, hoovering up all the apprentices, because they are not the whole supply chain. And primes themselves want their supply chain to have the skills so they can get the stuff that they need on time in an innovative way. So there are things that I think could make a substantial difference. Space, cyber, the integration with the other domains being one of those. But if we forget the people, no matter how much we move to an autonomous platform, and I believe in autonomy as the model for 21st century warfare, much more across lots of those domains, we can't forget the people, because there will always be people in our forces and the civilians supporting our forces, and the government has basically forgotten the people in our industrial strategy, and it is increasingly neglecting the views of the people who serve, and we see that because we are now losing more people from our armed forces than are joining, and that's because of poor defence housing, poor food, and general deterioration in morale at the very moment where we need more people. So big challenges ahead.
If it's a really quick question, I'm going to take one because I promise you would give so good.
Hi, so James Lawson from Helsing. Really great to hear about your commitment to capability development. But the challenge with capability development is that the traditional equipment and hardware takes a long time to procure. It only gets you marginal gains. By contrast, I've got a team working out in Ukraine on software and AI there. And within 2 weeks, we were able to deliver something that was 60 times better than the preceding equipment. So I'm curious what your approach is towards greater investment in software and AI and being able to get that more quickly.
I'll just say quickly, it really frustrates me that when I go into Royal Navy warships, I see Windows 98 on screens.
Yeah.
Because like an air gap is no longer a guarantor of cyber security for those stuff. We do need to have greater focus on spiral development, greater focus on R&D, and an understanding that the conflicts that are being fought today will not be the conflicts that we are asked to fight in the future if those things come up, but we have to be more innovative, more agile and flexible, and less dogmatic and procedural if we are to really make the most of those, because there's lessons to be learned from Ukraine, because Russia's learning those lessons, and if we don't learn those lessons, we run the risk of not being able to deter in the way that we'd like to in the future.
Can I just add very briefly? I think one of the things that we're going to have, when we're talking about AI and military, it would be really helpful if we had an agreed definition on what AI and military is. We know this is the space we're going to have to move into, but we're going to have to do. But one of the things that Russia's able to do really quickly is they aren't going to have to develop a moral and ethical framework that goes alongside it because they don't care. Whereas we very, very quickly need to do that, and we're getting behind because we haven't been able to keep up, and the government haven't invested in the way in which they should in this space. So from our perspective, making sure that we're all on the same page in the UK about how we're going to operate, and then financially investing to make sure that AI is complementary in this space and enhances what we've got without losing jobs, is a key part for this.
Thank you very much. And Steve, moving from big hardware plant to software-driven capabilities, your perspective?
Yeah, no, I think there's a real opportunity in front of us now with an incoming Labour government, of course, to reassess exactly where we are on defence. And as I think Ian mentioned earlier, to understand the risks that are posed to us, not just now, but into the future. And I completely agree on the points that are being made about cyber and space and artificial intelligence and the way in which artificial intelligence will develop and will interface with defence technologies and can be used as a weapon against us as well as a defence mechanism by ourselves. I mean, being abreast of all of that and at the same time challenging and addressing the chronic skills crisis that we face right now. And I know Labour are looking at that in a cross-departmental way, which is incredibly helpful because, of course, the Tories have not done that ever, actually. And there is very little cross-departmental work going on at the moment, and there's no industrial strategy and certainly no plan to deliver one. So, you know, there's a real opportunity in front of us now. But just the last word on procurement. I think we're too challenge-averse on procurement. I think we allow the threat of a challenge to stop us doing what we should be doing in the national interests. I think there are things that we can do to make sure under social and economic rationale that we procure from the UK quite and perfectly legitimately, even in an open tender. But when it comes to things like the FSS, I mean, that is a war vessel. It's a warship in every shape and every way in which you might want to describe it. And of course, the Tories made a conscious decision to outsource that overseas and well pay the price of that in the longer term in shipyards up and down the country.
Interesting that one company, very much dual use, has a huge defence footprint in this country, tried to sponsor some AI research with very much national security flavour to it at one of our bigger universities, and the only PhD candidates that came forward were Chinese. So that sort of rather tells us something. Right, the only point I'm going to make before I sum up is that in a certainly latter career that was spent much more in joint roles than in Air Force roles, I absolutely support everything you've said about jointry. Some of the best officers I've worked with across the services were in the joint environment. The incentives are for those that support their service to move on, and sadly, actually, one of them is now working in that company, so maybe he's still in the UK ecosystem, but it'd be better if they were still there running defence with a genuine joint culture. Thank you, panel. I can't possibly sum up that very rich discussion, but I just wanted to maybe throw some words out. Imagination came out, and I think imagination applied across the board, where we tend to have stovepipes to chase, in your words, Ruth, shiny things. And so imagination in the procurement sphere, especially as we move from the industrial to the information age, is going to be vital. You've all talked about skills and workforce, so I think thinking across the depth, and I was really delighted to hear you talk about working across the shadow cabinet with people involved in education, people involved with social policies. That's what provides that industrial base that we need, because without that you've only got a few shiny things and they won't last long. Our services aren't huge. If we need our industrial base to support them, we need a broader market, but we do have huge convening power in the UK. You mentioned things like the GEF and AUKUS. There are partnerships there to be leveraged, and in the question about revolving doors and what have you, and 10 years in charge, I really like the suggestion that you're going to introduce some accountability into these programmes as well. A really rich discussion there. I'm sorry I've let it overrun, but it was just too many interesting things to guillotine it exactly on the half hour. Could I ask you to thank our panel for an excellent discussion? Thank you.